All right, it's 6 o'clock and we only have half an hour, so let's get started. All right, so as you know, April is Autism Awareness Month. I'm very passionate about it as a man on the autism spectrum. And what I wanted to do is just really share the sort of work that we do. Hopefully you can take some ideas from it. If you do this work, that's great. You know, it's important to validate what you're doing. You might take some ideas, you might think about how you could do something a little bit differently, and that's great as well. Please feel free to share this video with your colleagues and other people once we load up to our YouTube channel. So the reason why that looking at inclusive curriculum is so important is if you're familiar with the nationally consistent collection of data for students with disability. One of the great things about this model of funding for schools is that you can impute a disability, so a student doesn't need to have a formal diagnosis. We know that in schools and in some communities it's really hard to do so. So based on the support put in place to support a student, a school can impute a disability for a student. So they're imputing the 4 categories of disability: cognitive, social, emotional, sensory, and physical. We don't impute a diagnosis. The federal government says teachers are not medical doctors. I'm not a real doctor. So we impute those 4 categories, but it's based on what a school does. But to impute a disability is a significant thing. The federal government says it takes a long time, and they put out a webinar on how to do that. So they talk about the things that you need to rule out first to impute a disability. So starting on the left-hand side of the table, first you've got to rule out learning difference. So if you've got a student who's a visual and hands-on learner, and a teacher talks at the student the whole time, and the student struggles, you can't impute a disability because the teacher's not taking into account the student's learning difference. Once they've done that, they've got to take into account learning difficulty. The student comes from an EALD background, school absenteeism, family circumstance like trauma, national disasters like COVID. And for the first time ever, the federal government has talked about you've got to rule out poor teaching. So lack of use of evidence-based strategies and not using the curriculum properly. So that's why developing an inclusive curriculum is so important. So let's have a look at some ideas of how we can actually do that. So this is a great piece of work that just came out actually today. So unintentionally, sometimes the way that we create curriculum documents and we implement the curriculum in schools can be a negative experience for students and put up a barrier to learning. So how do we overcome those things? Because incorrect use of the approved curriculum can create barriers for students. So let's have a look at an example. So if we look at this Year 9 Australian Curriculum English example, the green is the curriculum, the red is not the curriculum. So the difference between the top one and the bottom one, the green is the same, but in the bottom example, we've added a whole lot of things to the curriculum that actually are not required in the achievement standard. Here's another example from Year 4 from version 9 HAS. So green is the curriculum, red is not the curriculum. Red are those things that we add to the curriculum that actually aren't there at that C standard, that if we put those in, could be barriers to learning, which can hinder that process of developing inclusive curriculum, inclusive cultures in our classrooms. Let's have a look at another example. So imagine I'm teaching English and we're reading through a text and I've highlighted the text structures, highlighted the language features, and put those into mind maps. Then I've looked at my 2 mind maps and drawn connections between those mind maps. Then looked at those connections and created a Venn diagram of the similarities and differences between those text structures and language features. That is actually one of the skills in the Australian curriculum achievement standards and content descriptors. So let's have a look at that. So in Year 6 Australian Curriculum English, students analyse how text structures and language features work together to meet the purpose of a text. So if we define analyze to examine and break down information into parts, our mind maps, make inferences and find evidence to support generalizations, find meaning or relationships, finding connections between those 2 mind maps, and identifying patterns, similarities, and differences, our Venn diagram, that's demonstrating the skill of analysis in the Australian curriculum. So when we think about that versus adding teal paragraphs to the skill of analysis, we're adding those skills that actually aren't there. So at a B and an A level, you might add teal paragraphs, but the definition of analyze in the Australian curriculum is actually not teal paragraphs and isn't developing text. So it's important to deconstruct those achievement standards to look at what the skills are and what it's requiring students to demonstrate and not demonstrate. So when we think about the concept of equity, ACARA gives us a definition of equity in the Australian curriculum, and we'll have a look at it. The term is on the same basis. You might have heard it before. So it consists of 4 parts or 4 criteria to that definition. We're going to have a look at a couple of them today. So have a look at this criteria and the definition. What stands out is that not all students have to have the same experience, but are entitled to those equitable opportunities and choices. Another big thing is age equivalent content. So ACARA says that students should be taught the content descriptors of their year level, but can demonstrate along the spectrum of the achievement standards. So imagine I've got a student in year 7. They're taught the content descriptors of year 7, so the knowledge and skills, but the student might demonstrate up or down the achievement standards. So in this case, when we look at mathematics, I might teach the year 7 content descriptors, but I need to have a knowledge of the achievement standards up and down from foundation up to year 10, because personalized learning, according to ACARA, is teaching the content of the year level, so the knowledge and skills in the content descriptors, but a student might demonstrate up or down the achievement standards. So teachers need to have a knowledge of those different achievement standards. And in this case, we've taken the same achievement standard and aligned it to each different year level. It's a bit hard to know to do this personalized learning and in line with ACARA if we only know the achievement standard in relation to our year level. So we do need to have that breadth of understanding, or we need to collaborate with colleagues who have that knowledge. So let's have a look at the second criteria that relates to developing inclusive curriculum. Notice it talks about rigorous, relevant, and engaging learning opportunities for students, age equivalent context again, so the content descriptors of the student's year level, but notice the terms rigorous, relevant, and engaging. It should be relevant to our students. It doesn't mean relevant for the teacher, but relevant for the students that it's being taught to, and engaging for the learners. Is it engaging for the learners that are being taught, or is it engaging for the teacher? And the next thing is rigorous. We're not talking about academic rigor. We're talking about, are you teaching the Australian curriculum the way it's written and assessing it the way it's written? So let me give you an example. Let's have a look at an example of that. Let's look at the skill of identifying the Australian curriculum. This is the lowest level skill in the Australian curriculum content descriptors and achievement standards. So look at to recognize or name someone or something. So here's that skill and the year 5 achievement standards. So students identify similarities and differences in how ideas are presented and developed, including through characters, settings, and/or events. So in the year 5 achievement standards for English, students could name or recognize the similarities and differences and be a C standard. It doesn't say it has to be written. It doesn't talk about how it's done, but the skill for a C standard, the students are required to demonstrate that. Here's another example from year 7. Students identify the causes and effects of events, developments, and achievements connected to groups and individuals in Australia and other societies from the ancient past. So they simply have to name or recognize those things. It doesn't say how it's done. They simply have to name or recognize the causes and effects to be a C standard. It doesn't say it has to be written, doesn't say how it's done. So once we add those things that aren't there, we're no longer teaching and assessing the Australian curriculum in a rigorous way, and we're adding those things to the curriculum that could be barriers to the students. Here's another example from year 7 from science. Students identify potential ethical issues and intercultural considerations. So name or recognize potential ethical issues and intercultural considerations. Once again, it's not saying how it's done. It's saying what students have to do, but it's not telling us how the students have to do it. So to teach and assess the Australian curriculum in a rigorous way, we need to define those cognitive verbs and come to a collaborative understanding with our colleagues what it's asking our kids to demonstrate and not demonstrate. I don't read quotes on slides. I read a book that says that if you read quotes on slides, it splits people's cognitive loads. So if we're to get a successful and rigorous curriculum, we need to come back to it and deconstruct it. This is the definition of universal design for learning from the federal government in relation to the nationally consistent collection of data. It talks about an approach that considers the needs of all learners from the beginning. So it's that initial planning process, not teaching and assessing and teaching in a certain way. Students make struggle and then we make changes. It's thinking about how we can make it as accessible as possible for all learners. And that's the same with the curriculum. So to do that, we look at the content descriptors in the Australian curriculum. We need to work out what is the essential knowledge that students need to be taught and what are the essential skills they need to be modeled. And to do that, we look at the content descriptors. What I really like about version 9 of the Australian curriculum is when you click on the achievement standard, it takes you to the content descriptors to be taught. So we can deconstruct that content descriptor. We can have a look at the elaborations. What is great about version 9 is it tells us that all elaborations are optional. Whilst they're optional, it kind of gives you those boundaries of what is acceptable in a school. So if we look at it, what is the essential knowledge that we need to teach our kids about clauses and then about embedded clauses that add information and expand ideas? If we look at the cognitive verb, it's examine, and we define that. So to determine the nature or condition of something. So that's the skills that we need to model for our kids. This is the case model from ACARA that talks about personalized learning. It talks about how we support kids with diverse learning needs to access the curriculum and be successful at school. So the C part of the case model is that content descriptors of a chronological age or year level of a student. So what we need to do is we need to deconstruct those content descriptors to ensure that we're teaching the essential knowledge and modeling the essential skills. Then when we come to the achievement standards, we need to look at them and deconstruct them and work out what is it that students required to demonstrate and not demonstrate. And like many things, sometimes it's easier to work out what the achievement standard is not asking kids to demonstrate. So having a look at this one, it's from year 2 mathematics, version 9. Students use uniform and formal units to measure and compare shapes and objects. So we can work out what are the students required to demonstrate and what are they not required to demonstrate. They're not using formal units like millimeters and centimeters. They're not required to look at area. They're not required to justify their comparison. And it doesn't say it must be written response to demonstrate the achievement standard. So by deconstructing that achievement standard, defining any cognitive verbs, in this case is simply use, we can start to make the curriculum more accessible for our kids. And it's the S part of that case model. Remembering that that knowledge of the achievement standards up and down is really, really vital. But consistency of understanding is vital. So let's have a look at a bit of a video from the Queensland Department of Education. It is a couple of years old now, so a couple of things have changed around version 9, but we'll have a chat about those.
The Australian curriculum is a curriculum for all students. It is an inclusive curriculum defined by its capacity to recognise and respond to the diversity of learners. So how can we support all students to access and demonstrate their learning against the achievement standards? The whole school approach to differentiated teaching and learning supports teachers to ensure success for all students. In order to remove potential barriers to learning, teachers need to have a deep understanding of the Australian curriculum achievement standards, including the key terms. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to start by looking at the glossaries for each learning area. The key terms are already defined in an inclusive way and consider diverse learners and their access needs. The key terms support teachers to plan differentiated teaching and learning. It's about looking at the curriculum through an inclusive lens of what our students can do. For example, if we look at the English glossary, the definition of the term write is inclusive of the different ways students can write. This means that when an aspect of the achievement standard requires a student to write, students can demonstrate this by using a scribe to transcribe a student's verbal or signed response, a braille device, sequence drawings or photos, such as a photo story, eye gaze technology and software, handwriting, speech-to-text assistive technology, or typing, which can include the use of spell check and word prediction.
So interesting. If the achievement standards say that students write maybe in English, student can do any of those options. They can have a scribe, they can use speech to text, they can type, they could draw, put photos or drawings together. You know, they could use a braille device or eye gaze technology. So they're all the options, and handwriting. They're all the options available in the definition of write. So they're not adjustments. That's just what the curriculum allows. So in relation to the NCCD, that's quality differentiated teaching practice. So if a teacher says an assessment task must be done in handwriting, that's putting up a barrier for learning for kids who can't demonstrate it through handwriting. But by coming back and deconstructing the Australian curriculum, we can see all the options that are available for students. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater and let everyone do everything, but it might be if a parent comes to you and says, oh, my child really struggles with handwriting, you know, and they're really struggling to demonstrate the Australian curriculum and do assessment tasks like that. Is there anything else you can do? Yeah, there's other options I can try. What about some of these? Let's have a look at a little bit more of this video, and that delves a little bit more into handwriting.
Sometimes the key terms can be unintentionally interpreted in a way that creates barriers for learners.
So teachers are wrong.
For example, writing can be misinterpreted as handwriting, but clearly that's not correct. Handwriting differs to writing. Handwriting is defined in the English glossary as the production of legible, correctly formed letters by hand or with the assistance of writing tools, for example, pencil grip or assistive technology. Unless handwriting itself is being assessed, which it may be, but only in prep to Year 3 English, a student does not need to handwrite to demonstrate their writing or respond to assessment tasks in other learning areas using handwriting.
So the video is saying that outside of prep to Year 4 English in version 9 of the curriculum, if the achievement standard's not talking about handwriting, students don't have to handwrite anything. So in secondary school, a student doesn't have to actually handwrite any assessment tasks to demonstrate the Australian curriculum. Interesting. By making everything handwriting, if a student struggles to handwrite, then that's putting up a barrier, as the video talks about. Why this is important is in Universal Design for Learning, the learning goal taken from the approved curriculum isn't tied to a specific way of demonstrating it. So in this case, by tying, say, handwriting to the achievement standard when it's not there, that might be a barrier for students. You know, you might take the broader definition of write and allow some students to handwrite, some students to type, some students to use speech to text, and some students to have a scribe. But if the achievement standard is actually not talking about writing, it doesn't actually have to be written. And then it's thinking about how else it could be demonstrated. So, but what happens if the curriculum we are teaching is not accurate? So I'm going to show you a little bit of an experiment now. We're going to go to Kahoot. Can you open up Kahoot? And I'm going to give you a pin, and we're going to test your knowledge of some of the skills that are in the Australian curriculum with content descriptors and achievement standards, because our experience is it's not about the writing, it's about the consistency of teaching the Australian curriculum accurately. So we're going to bring up Kahoot, and we're going to play a bit of a Kahoot quiz. And then we're going to get you to go in And we're going to test your knowledge of some of the cognitive verbs in the Australian curriculum. There's just 6 questions. It'll go pretty quickly. You get a minute. You'll have multiple choice options. Each one are different definitions from ACARA. These aren't QCAA definitions or from somewhere else, like C2C. These are ACARA definitions. So I'll get you to open up Kahoot. I'll get you to put the pin in, create a name, give yourself an avatar. And I'm going to just want to show you what happens when teachers don't talk, because obviously we're different locations. What happens if teachers don't talk in the process of planning? Here we go. So how do you define the skill of explain in the Australian curriculum? So if you're teaching the skill of explain or assessing the skill of explain, what are you teaching and assessing? So there's 4 multiple choice answers, all definitions from ACARA. What is the skill that you're teaching and assessing? So choose which one you think is correct and then click on it. You'll get points for how quick and accurate you are. Interesting. So explain is the cognitive verb or the skill that occurs the most in the Australian curriculum from prep to 10 in all learning areas. Yet as a group, we're teaching and assessing 4 different things. So straight away, we're not using the curriculum rigorously. Explain is provide extra information that demonstrates understanding, application, or reasoning. By not going back to the curriculum and working out what the definition of that skill is, we might be making it too difficult or too easy for our kids and not preparing them for the next year level. So how do you define the skill of compose in the Australian curriculum? What are you teaching and assessing for the skill of compose? That's much better this time. So what the research shows is we can ensure accuracy around the curriculum when teachers plan together. So having a look at that definition compose is very similar to the red one, but the red one is actually a high level skill. So it's that idea that if we don't come back to the Australian curriculum as a source and collaborate in that planning process with teachers, we might end up with very different interpretations of the curriculum. Examine. How do you define the skill of examine? So if we're teaching the skill of examine and assessing the skill of examine, what are we teaching and assessing? How do you find the skill of evaluate? What are you teaching and assessing for the skill of evaluate? This is one of the higher order thinking skills in the Australian curriculum. What are you teaching and assessing for the skill of evaluate? Interesting. So notice once again the difference in responses. So the research says if teachers plan collaboratively, talk about the curriculum, and go back to the curriculum as its source, you'll get more of an accurate or rigorous use of the curriculum. This is what happens if teachers plan independently. They get different interpretations of curriculum. Organize. How do you define the skill of organize? What are you teaching and assessing for the skill of organize? Once again, remember, at your school, when you're planning together, teachers talking using the Australian curriculum source as a source, using those glossary terms is really important to overcome that difference. Let's have a look at, just do one more, show what happens when teachers don't talk at the planning table. Notice what happens if it's very obvious, but if it's not, then we can end up with those differences. And sometimes those differences are what makes it hard for our kids and makes inclusive education really difficult. So we're currently doing a study at the moment with the University of Southern Queensland, and we've tested 1,500 teachers using this, a similar Kahoot, and you can see the differences in response. So the grey line is how accurate teachers were with these skills. The blue and the orange are how frequent they occur in version 8.4 and version 9. And interestingly enough, have a look at Explain. Only 25% of those 1,500 teachers were accurate, but it is the skill that dominates the Australian curriculum. So what are they teaching and assessing around that skill of Explain? Maybe we're making it harder or simpler by deconstructing the achievement standards and using those definitions. So have a look at this year 10 Australian curriculum. We can start to look at what the curriculum is asking kids to do and not adding those things that it's not asking them to do. So have a look at this one. Students evaluate strategies to address a geographical phenomenon or challenge using environmental, social, and economic criteria. We can start to establish frameworks that allow our students to demonstrate those achievement standards. So students could have a scribe for this. They could type into it. They could handwrite it. They could use speech to text. You know, by not adding those things that aren't there, we can make it easier for our kids. And when those texts, those achievement standards do require kids to demonstrate text, we can think about those scaffolds that support them to do that. So let's have a look at this achievement standard that relates to the previous one. And this is about developing texts and explanations and synthesizing research. We can then create those scaffolds that support kids. Once again, the kids could handwrite, they could type into this, they could speech to text, they could get a scribe. But it's about providing those kids opportunities to develop, to access that curriculum and be successful. So this is a C standard at that year 10. Notice it's not adding those things, it's not dumbing it down by adding sentence starters or closed paragraphs, but it's providing opportunities for kids to be successful. And we're not adding those elements like handwriting that actually aren't named in the achievement standard. So I'm very short today looking at how we can develop an inclusive curriculum. Maybe have a think about what 3 things you might try from looking at today that you might try at your school or commit to doing. So just before we go, if you're interested in this work, everything we create with schools, we put on Teachers Pay Teachers. Everything is free. So every assessment task, every lesson, every unit, every activity that we create with teachers around Australia, we put up for free on Teachers Pay Teachers. I'd encourage you to have a look at that. We're running a lot of workshops over the next 10 months. So obviously these Autism Awareness Month workshops, but we are running full day workshops. If you're interested, the dates are there. If our work is something that you're interested in and your school is interested in, we know that budgets are really tight. But what we can do is if your school provides us with a free venue for the workshop, no matter where you are in Australia, we will provide your school with at least 4 free tickets. We then sell the remainder on Eventbrite to cover our expenses. Then we'll run the workshop at your school on a date negotiated by the school. We cover all expenses, travel, accommodation, as well as catering for the day. So there are no expenses for the school. If you're interested, our email address is there. Please reach out to us and we'd love to run a workshop at your school, no matter where you are in Australia. Often, if we don't sell any tickets, we'll still run the workshop for free in your school. So we're happy to work with your staff if we don't sell any free tickets. So you sell any tickets on Eventbrite. Please follow us on our social media pages. Encourage, share it with friends, get them to like it, because we are trying to promote inclusive education, especially during Autism Awareness Month, helping teachers and educators enable kids on the spectrum to access the learning process. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have recorded this. We'll add it to our YouTube channel and share it on our social media pages. We'll send you a copy of the PowerPoint. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you get to join us again this coming Wednesday. So